Greetings, aviators! Welcome back to the channel. Part 1 of our Longitude tutorial series coming up on today's episode of 2020 Flight Simmers. Welcome back, everyone. Before we get started in today's video, I just have one disclaimer. I am not a pilot, so I will not be focusing on procedures throughout the duration of this series. The aim of the series is to better help you understand the systems, the avionics, and all the ins and outs of the Cessna Citation Longitude. Throughout the duration of this series, we will also be using the Citation Longitude mod that can be found over at flightsim.to. Links will be down below in the description, so be sure to check that out. Once you have the mod installed, make sure to go to your livery section, and you should have a livery that is marked FDE Fix and the version number. The last mod that we're using for the Longitude can be found in the marketplace. Now let's go over the structure for the Longitude series. Part 1 will be cockpit orientation and familiarization, where we'll go over all the avionics inside of the aircraft. Part 2 will be flight plan input into the G5000. Part 3 will be autopilot preparation, taxi, and takeoff to cruise. And Part 4 will be descent, arrival, approach, and landing. If you have any questions along the way, please post them down below in the comments section, and I'll get right back to you. And if the video helps you out, be sure to hit that subscribe, tick on that little bell, and smash that thumbs up button. It is greatly appreciated.
Today we'll start with what you only think you know.
Welcome to the cockpit of the awesome Cessna Longitude. Before we get started with any of the avionics, I think the first thing we got to do is get some power to the aircraft. To get down to the electrical panel, you're going to use Control 7 on your keyboard. Once you do, you'll see the electrical panel over here on the right-hand side, so let's go over a couple things first. One thing to note about the Longitude is there are two power buses on this aircraft. You have a left-hand side and a right-hand side. That'll make more sense here in just a second. Right next to our battery switches, we have external power available. So let's go ahead and turn that on. One thing that you may have noticed once we turned on the external power is the bus tie switch in the very center went from open to close. Now, one thing to know about the bus tie switch is that it does not really function, but it will switch to the appropriate setting depending on where your power is coming from. Now, another thing to notice about the electrical panel is we have a bunch of white lines, kind of look like a maze, with little bars that shoot out to individual switches or buttons. What this is going to show us is the path of electricity throughout the systems. So if we take a look at the right-hand side, the external power and the right-hand battery are both on the right-hand side of the aircraft. Then that travels up to the bus tie, to the right side gen, and the right side electric and right side main. What the bus tie will allow us to do is to close the circuit between right and left-hand sides to allow both sides of the aircraft to have power. When we turn our battery power on both right and left-hand side, that will be down here, and we turn our external power off, you will now notice that the bus tie goes in the open position. Now that's because we have our aircraft now being powered by both right and left-hand batteries of the aircraft. If we turn external power back on, you'll see the bus tie goes closed, and that is to preserve our battery power so that we're mainly using our external power. So let's take a look at the top of the electrical panel. All these switches that you see up here are automatically in the correct position when you get power to the aircraft. So there's no need to mess with any of those. But for those wondering if they do function, yes, all the switches do function at the very top, and you'll see the CAS warnings that will show up on our PFD at the very top. Below those switches, we have our left gen and our right gen to the aircraft. To the left of the left side generator, we have our standby power switch. The standby power switch, when turned on, will turn on our standby instruments right above the MFD screen. So if you find your standby instruments are not on, make sure that you come down here and turn the switch on. Below the generators, we have the APU gen, and of course the left and right battery with external power. On the left-hand side, we have a couple knobs over here. None of the buttons down here function. The top knobs are going to control all the lighting for our PFD control panel, as well as the PFD screen. So the outer knob or the lower knob is going to control the dimming on our PFD. The upper knob or inner knob is going to control the lighting over here on the control panel. So we're just going to go ahead and leave these up. Below that, we have a map light, and if we turn that up, you'll see a little light that's going to populate right here. So now I hope you have a better understanding of how the electrical panel works on this aircraft. The next thing that we're going to go over is the lighting system, or how to operate all the lights on this aircraft. If you hit Control 9 on your keyboard, that'll bring you up to the overhead panel, and this is where you can find all of your lights, panel lights, floodlights, as well as the emergency lights, and we'll go ahead and flip that on ARM. So now working from top down, we're just going to hit Control 2 on our keyboard, and that's going to take us down to our autopilot panel. Across the top of our autopilot panel, these are all the modes that we can put the autopilot in. Starting here on the left, we have our flight director, vertical speed, our VNAV. Now, unfortunately, the VNAV does not work in the ascent phase of your flight, but it will work in the descent phase of your flight. We'll go over how to use that later in this series. Next to VNAV, we have our flight level change, autopilot master in the center. To the right of the autopilot, we have our navigation mode, our heading hold mode, approach mode, and altitude hold mode. Below all of the mode buttons, we have all of the selectors that we're going to use to adjust those different modes. Starting on the left-hand side, we have our left course knob. This is only going to be used for VOR navigation. This will not be used if you are in FMS mode. To the right of that, we have our vertical speed dial. This is to adjust our vertical speed up or down. To the right of that, and below the flight level change, we have our speed control. Now this knob is comprised of two separate knobs. We have the inner knob, which is right here. Now if we push on this, this will switch between IAS and Mach mode. We will also use the center knob to adjust the speed that will be displayed down here on our PFD. At the current moment, we are in FMS mode, so you're not able to change the speed that's going to populate on your PFD panel. The outer selector on this dial is going to select either between FMS or manual speed. This will allow us to change the speed setting that is displayed on our PFD. For instance, if I click on this, it will switch to manual. You will also notice that the speed has changed colors from magenta to like an aqua green color. At this point, we are now able to change our speed on the PFD. To the right of the speed dial, we have the CPL, and that does not function. We also have a bank button. What this will do is, while you're in autopilot mode, if you turn the bank on, it will not allow the plane to bank any harder than probably 15 or 20 degrees. I'm not sure the exact figure. To the right of that, we have our heading knob, and this is, of course, going to adjust our heading on the PFD. If you would like to sync your heading bug with your actual heading, all you need to do is press in on this knob, and you'll see that the heading has just sunk to our HSI. To the right of that, we have our back course button. I've never really used back course, so I really can't comment on if that works or not. To the right of that, we have our altitude selector, and as you can see on our PFD, that will change our altitude for us. And the right course knob, and this will control the course on the Copilot PFD. If we slide over to the left, we also have another panel here, and you have one of these on each side of the aircraft. What this is going to do is this will only control what is on your PFD screen. Now, not all these buttons actually function. There's only a couple that work. So the range works, and if I move this in and out, you'll see the inset map changing. If you do a split screen here, it will change the range on that as well. All the way on the right-hand side, we have our baro knob. We can roll that left or right. And if you press in on it, it will go to standard baro. Press on it one more time, and now you can go back to setting your own barometric pressure. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the Copilot side of the aircraft. On the Copilot side of the aircraft, we have a couple things down here on the panel that are useful to us, and some of the other things that don't work. So on the right-hand side of this panel, most of these buttons do not work, but the knobs do function. This is going to control the Copilot PFD and the Copilot control panel on the right-hand side. You also have the map light that does work as well, and also the ELT switch. To the left-hand side of this panel, we have our gear lever, and we also have all of our ice protection right next to that. So we have our left and right engine ice protection. we have our wing ice protection and our stabilizing surface. I believe that's what that means for ice protection. Below that, we have the pitot static, and this is going to be in the normal position. You can also turn it on if you'd like to force it on. All right, so that should take care of everything from the center console up. So now let's go ahead and take a look at everything that is down on the center pedestal. If you hit Control 4 on your keyboard, it will take us to the upper portion of our pedestal here. So let's start at the top of the pedestal, and then we can work our way down. Over here on the left-hand side, this is also going to be lighting controls, but it's going to be the lighting controls for our MFD, as well as the MFD control panel here. So if we turn this down, you can see that the control panels will dim, as well as the MFD screen up here will go dim if we turn the outer knob. Below that, on the left-hand side, we have the primary trim channel. That is a non-functioning button. The secondary trim, and this is going to be covered by a little flap. You need to click on that, and then you can turn on your secondary trim. I'm not sure when you would actually want to use a secondary trim, but maybe somebody can let me know down below in the comments. Below the secondary trim button, we also have our nose up and down trim for the aircraft. So now let's go over here to the right-hand side of the pedestal. Starting at the top, we have some hydraulic switches here that, again, are automatically in the normal position. These do function, and we will go through what these do later on. Below the hydraulic switches, we have the PTCU, which stands for the Power Transfer Control Unit. I know that may not mean a lot to you right now, so let me explain what that is used for. The PTCU is used to supply backup hydraulic power to both A and B systems. So for those of you who are wondering if this does function in the aircraft, yes it does, and we will go over that later. Below that, we have our rudder standby, which is already in the normal position, but it does function. Fuel boost pumps, and these are in the normal position, and these also function. Gravity transfer, this does not function as of right now. And below that is our transfer switch. This will allow us to switch fuel from either the right to left or left to right tanks. Starting on the left-hand side, this would be our parking brake, control lock, which does not function. We have the aileron trim and rudder trim all the way at the bottom. Moving to the top of the screen here, we have all of our engine starting functions. On the right-hand side, we have our right starter. To the right of that, we have the run button that is covered by a protective flap. So we need to click on that first, and then we can click on the run. Below that is the pressurization system for the aircraft. Again, all of these buttons are in the appropriate position, and you shouldn't have to mess with any of these if you do not wish to do so. The pressurization panel is very similar to the electrical panel in that we have this little maze of white lines that connect various systems together. This will allow us to see the path of the pressurized air. Over on the right-hand side, we have our flap control. We have our flap reset button, which doesn't do anything. And last but not least is our APU start and on switch down here at the bottom. All right, so that should take care of all of the autopilot, lighting, pedestal controls. So now let's get to the meat and potatoes of this, and let's dive into the G5000. We'll start by going over to the PFD control panel, and we'll work our way to the MFD section. There's a lot going on here, so let's start off with everything at the top of the panel first. To adjust any of the frequencies inside of the comms, we're going to click on the standby, and now we can set whatever frequency we would like in our comm. If we do not want to transfer, then don't hit the transfer button, just hit the enter button, and it will input that in our standby. If for some reason that you want to just make a frequency active, just type in the frequency, hit transfer, and it will automatically transfer that. If you have a frequency in your standby and you're ready to transfer, you don't have to go back through this menu to do so. You can just tap on the COM1 button, and it will switch that frequency to your active. In between COM1 and COM2, we have a mic and a monitor button. The mic button will allow us to switch either between COM1 or COM2 frequencies to actually be talking on. Below that is our monitor switch. This will allow us to monitor either one channel or both channels at the same time. Now, for those of you wondering when you would want to do this, here's a great example. Let's say you're in on an approach or you're getting close to your approach, and you need to find out the ATIS of the arrival airport. As you know, ATC does not like you signing off of the frequency unless you ask for permission. So what you would do in this situation is put the ATIS frequency in your COM2, and then you would click on the monitor button, and you can now monitor COM1 and COM2 at the same time. So if ATC has something to say to you, you can hear them, you can respond to them, but you can also listen to the ATIS in the background. To the right-hand side, we have our traffic map button, and if we go over here to the right a little bit, we tap on the map button, you will see it'll input a little inset map for us on the PFD. Now before we move to the bottom half, there's one more menu that we need to go over, and that is the audio and radio menu. If we click on that, we have several different things that we can do in here now. At the very top of this menu, here's where we're going to be able to adjust our NAV1 and NAV2 frequencies. It's a little bit more difficult than the COM frequencies. Let me show you what I'm talking about. To adjust any of the frequencies for our NAV1 and NAV2, we're going to click on the control box to the right. We can now enter whatever frequency we want. If we want to transfer it, we hit transfer. If we don't, we can just hit enter. Here's the problem with this now. There's no quick way to transfer your standby frequency to your main frequency. So you would literally have to go back in here, hit transfer to switch your nav frequencies. Now there's a couple tricks to this, and we'll get to that once we get into the flight planning, that will make it a little bit easier to program in your ILS frequencies. On the left-hand side, we have a NAV1 and NAV2 button that actually light up, and next to that we have a volume control. Now for those of you who don't know this, all of the VORs and NDBs will always have an audible identifier. This way it will let you know that you are on the correct frequency. So let's take a look at this approach plate real quick, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Next to any of the VORs, you're going to see a series of dots or dashes. And what this will let us know is if we are on the correct frequency. So for any dot, you're going to hear a short beep, and for every dash, you're going to hear a long beep. So now to be able to hear the identifier through your speakers of the aircraft, we need to activate that by just tapping on this, and you'll see a green light that's going to appear. That'll let us know that once we get close enough to that frequency, you will then start hearing those beeps coming through your speaker system. Once you know you're on the correct frequency, it's always a good idea to uncheck this so you don't get bombarded with all these beeps all the time. Below that, we also have our COM frequencies, and we can either adjust those here or at the very top. I will say if you're going to adjust COM frequencies here, it's just like the nav. So let's go down here by clicking on the down button. Below that, we have a marker identifier. One thing you may also notice is when you're on approach, you will hear a beep, and sometimes you'll even have a visual light that's going to appear inside the cockpit to let you know if you're at the outer marker, the middle marker, or right at the runway or the threshold for your landing. This is just one more piece of information to give you more awareness of where you are in relation to your landing. To the right of that, we have the high sense button. I'm not really sure what this does, so if anybody knows, let me know down in the comments. Below the marker, we have our ADF. So this is going to be for your NDBs. To the right-hand side, this is where we're able to input the frequency for our NDB. To the left of the frequency, we also have a button here so that we can hear the audible identifier for the NDB. We hit the down button. Got a couple more things here, and this is going to get really important down here below. At the very bottom, we have either DME1 or DME2. Now, some might say, why do we need to have separate audible alerts for DMEs, or why do we need to have separate frequencies for DMEs? So let me explain why you would want to have these. Let's bring up that same approach chart, and if we look at the very top, under the localizer box, we can see it gives us a frequency for our localizer. Now, one thing to note about ILSs is not every ILS has a DME associated with it. How you will be able to know if you have a DME associated with your ILS is you will actually have a channel number underneath of the localizer. So if we take a look at this approach plate real quick, under the localizer box at the very top, you can see that it says loc/DME and a channel number for the DME. So that's how you're going to identify whether a VOR or the ILS has a DME associated with it. If we take a look at the approach plate, at the very bottom here, we can see the localizer is 111.7. Right next to that localizer, we have a VOR that has DME associated with it for 113.0. So on this particular approach, when you need to know the distance you are from the runway, you're going to need to use the VOR for your DME and the localizer for your autopilot. So now let me show you how we're going to use this and input this into the G5000. If we take a look at the DME buttons here, on the right-hand side, if we click on the control box, this will not allow us to change a frequency here. It's automatically going to be set for nav1. So whatever your nav1 frequency is, it will populate it here because it wants to pull DME information from that nav frequency. But in this particular scenario, we do not have a DME associated with the localizer. So here's how we're going to do this. We're going to go up. We're then going to go to nav. We want to program our DME first. So we're going to look at the DME is going to be 113.0, and that's what we're going to enter here. So 113.0, transfer. We're now going to go down in the list, and you can see that that DME has now populated here. At this point, we're going to click on the control box, hit the hold button, and now what it's going to do is hold that DME frequency in the DME box. We go back up to the top, go back to our approach plate one more time. We can see the localizer is 111.7. And now we will input 111.7 and hit transfer. So now what we have essentially done is set up our G5000 to be able to use the ILS for our approach. And if we go down, we now have the VOR programmed into our DME so that we can see a distance from the runway. So that's how you're going to use the DME feature in the G5000. After you have done your landing, you need to make sure that you go back in here and switch this to nav1 so it doesn't mess you up on any future flights. Now, I'm pretty sure that when you exit the sim and load back in, that it will automatically go back to nav1 and nav2, so you won't really have to worry about it. But it's just something to check out. Next to the DME frequency, we also have the marker button, and this is to allow you to hear the identifier through your speakers. Now keep in mind in this situation, because we are using two separate frequencies, one for the localizer and one for our DME, they both have separate identifiers to go with them. So make sure you don't get those confused. So now let's take a look at the lower portion of the PFD control, and starting over here on the left-hand side is our nav source. If we want to follow the GPS route, we want to make sure that the nav source is on FMS, and if you look on your HSI here in the center, you will see that we are in FMS mode. If we tap on this one more time, it will go into VOR1 or LOC1. Tap it one more time, it'll go into LOC2. One thing to note here, when we're switching between the different VORs, you will notice that the lines inside of the HSI are completely different. Bearing 1, if we turn that on, you will notice that we will have a bearing indicator right here at the lower portion of our PFD. But it's going to give us information about whatever frequency we have programmed in. So now let me give you a quick example. Let's take that approach we were looking at earlier again. In this scenario, if we use the first method that we went over earlier in the video, where we are going to be inputting the ILS frequency into our nav1 and the VOR DME frequency into the DME1, then all of the information is going to populate on the lower left-hand corner of your PFD. If you're going to be using method 2 in this scenario, you would input your ILS frequency into nav1 and your VOR DME information into nav2. You would then set your bearing 1 or bearing 2 to your nav2 frequency. Your DME information will now populate over here on the lower right-hand corner of the PFD. So that's just a good example of how you would use the DME information separately. I hope that makes sense, and if you have any questions, please let me know down below in the comments. Below our bearing 1 and 2, we have the speed bug page, so if we tap on that, you can turn on any one of the speed bugs, or you can turn all the bugs on or off. We also have our landing speed bugs here that we can turn on or off as well. You also have the ability to change each of these speeds independently just by clicking on the speed, entering, and hit enter. Next to that, we have the timer page, so if you need to use a timer, there it is. To the right of that, we have our minimums page, and this is going to give us an audible alert when we are down to a certain altitude.
Check. Minimums.
To input a minimum, all we need to do is, of course, just enter and hit enter. And on the PFD, we will see the baro minimum 250 feet. Now, in the minimums page, we have two different ways in which we can read the altitude. Either the baro, which would use our altimeter. Now that's going to be in MSL. So if you're using that, you need to make sure you're using an MSL number here. You can also click on this and change to a radio altitude. And this is now going to be AGL because it will give a radio altitude from the ground. When we hit enter on that, go back up to the PFD, you will see that we are now in radio altitude minimum. At the very bottom on the left-hand side, we have the PFD map settings. We left click on there. On the left-hand side, this will give us all of the buttons that we're going to need for the little inset map that's going to go on our screen. So we can turn the map off. Turn the HSI map on, so that'll populate right here in the center. We can just turn the inset, traffic map, and we also have map detail that we can adjust here. To the right-hand side, this will give us all of the functions that we have on the little maps that we can display. So we have our traffic map that we can turn on, and that'll show any aircraft in the vicinity on your inset map. To the right of traffic, we also have some settings that you can turn on or off. I just leave it in auto. This way it'll turn the traffic on at the appropriate time. In the center here, we have altitude display. Now, this is going to display the altitude of the other aircraft that are around you in either two different modes. Relative, so that would be relative to you. So if you're at, say, 5,000 feet, the other person is at 6,000 feet, it will only show that other person at 1,000 feet higher than you. It won't give their exact altitude. In absolute mode, this will give you the absolute altitude for that other aircraft. Below that, we have the altitude range, and I just leave this on unrestricted. You also can choose above, normal, or below. I'm not sure what the range distances are on those, but if somebody can let me know on that, that would be greatly appreciated. Over on the right-hand side, we have the Traffic ADS B button. This stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. This allows equipped aircraft and ground vehicles to broadcast their identification, position, altitude, and velocity to other aircraft and ATC. Underneath of your traffic display, we have the motion vector, and it's currently set in the off position. If we tick on that, we can now show the motion or the vector for the other aircraft. Then we also have a vector duration that we can show as well. Again, I try to leave as much of this stuff off because I don't want it cluttering up my screen here. At the very bottom, we have a map settings button, and we can also turn on or off labels and adjust the distance in which they're going to be displayed. So now let's go back. Below the traffic, we have the terrain button. If we click on this, we can turn it off, put it on absolute, or relative. Again, this will operate the same as the traffic, so if you have it in absolute, it's going to give you the absolute height of your terrain in a color on your screen. I don't think it's actually going to give you any figures, but it's going to display in color. So the higher it is, the redder it is. I think that's a word, redder. All right, so we're going to hit back on that. And over to the right-hand side, we have the settings tab, and that really doesn't give us anything here. Below that, we have the radar. So what the radar is going to do is actually show us a weather radar overlaid on top of our map here. Because I'm using custom weather, you're not going to see any weather conditions pop up on the screen, but you have the ability to set the distance in which that's going to be displayed. If we hit down on this menu, well, we don't have any other features here as of yet, but I'm sure they're coming soon. Back to the home menu, we have one more option down here on the right, and that's going to be our PFD settings. On the left-hand side, we have a couple tabs, so we'll start with the PFD tab first. We have a horizon heading, and what that's going to do is turn on the horizon heading you see right here. Below the horizon, we have our wind settings that will be displayed on the lower left-hand corner of our PFD. As you can see right here, we have no wind data to display, That usually won't populate until you get airborne. But if you click on the options, we have a couple different options. Unfortunately, they don't tell you what they are, so you're just going to have to pick them and choose the best one that you like. Below that, we have AOA, or angle of attack. I always leave this in auto. Most of the time, this is only going to populate on your screen, I believe on takeoff or landing. You can also turn it on all the time, and that'll give us this pretty little angle of attack gauge. If we just tap down on the menu, we have two more selections. We have the baro units, which we can select in either inches or hectopascals, and we can also overlay meters on top of our feet. So we turn this on and look up, you will see that we have a meter as well as our foot altitude. Over on the left-hand side, we can go down to the SVT. This will turn off the terrain on your PFD. So you'll see we just have a gray screen here. I like to keep that on. Below that, we have general, and here we can change our time format as well as the comm spacing. So depending on what part of the world you're in, you may want to go with the 8.3 spacing. Below all of these settings, we have a split screen button, and if we hit that button, it will now take that inset map and populate it over here on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, like I told you earlier, you can use the range button at the top to zoom in or out. You can also use the range button at the bottom to zoom in or out here as well. If you press in on this button, you will see that we now have a cursor that's populated on the screen, and we can move that cursor around if we so wish to do so. In the center here of the control panel, we have a pilot volume. Over on the right-hand side, this knob will allow us to change our comm frequencies and switch between COM 1 and COM 2 to adjust the frequency. It won't switch your mic between COM 1 and COM 2. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If we roll on the inner part of the knob, you'll see it changes all the numbers to the right of the decimal. The outer knob will change everything to the left of the decimal. If I want to switch to manipulate COM 2, I can press in, and it will now switch over to COM 2. If you want to switch the standby to active, you still have to press on the COM 1 or the COM 2 buttons. Now it's going to get a little confusing when we move over to the center MFD control panels. I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a second. Let's start off with the very top of these control panels, and each of these panels can work independently of each other. So make sure you keep that in the back of your head now too. At the very top of the MFD control panels, you'll have all of the very same information or menus as you do on the PFD control panel. The only difference here is we now have a transponder. If we press on that, we can now set the transponder. If we click below the transponder, we can change our squawk code that ATC would give us. When you're done, make sure you hit enter. This is also where you're going to ident if they ask you to ident. So the first thing that we're going to do is make sure that we are in full screen mode for the left-hand side control panel. It'll make it a little bit easier for me to show you what I'm talking about here before we start getting into all the split screens, because then you can really get confused. Under the first setting here, under map settings, if we tick on that, we can choose several different things. We can orient the map up, track up, or heading up. Below that, we have a map sync button. I leave that off. I'm not really sure what that does. If you can let me know down in the comments, that'd be great. Map detail is pretty self-explanatory. On the right-hand side, we have many different options that we can apply to this particular map. Under the sensor tab, we can show traffic on or off. We also have our traffic settings, just like we did on the PFD. We also have the terrain, just like we did on PFD, and we have the radar as well. Below that, we have the inset window tab. The inset window is this little window at the very bottom, which will show your active flight plan along with your VNAV profile, either for ascent or descent. Under the aviation tab, we can now choose several different things here. So we can show airspaces, airports, VORs, intersections, NDBs, waypoints, and we can set the distance in which they're going to show up for us. The last tab that we have is Other, and we have three different things that we can choose in here. The first tab is north up above a certain nautical mile distance. I'm not 100% on this one, but because I use north up all the time, I don't really need this. Below that, we have track vector. This will show the vector of your aircraft on the MFD. You also can change the duration of that as well. All the way at the very bottom, we have selected altitude range arc. This is probably the most important one in this particular menu because this will give us a little blue range arc. So for instance, if we have our altitude set at 20,000 feet and we are climbing to that altitude, we will see a little arc that's going to be in front of our plane, which will tell us if we keep ascending at this rate, we're going to wind up or end up at that altitude at that particular point. Again, we'll go over more of that once we get into the flight portion of the series. So now let's go back to the main page. Now keep in mind that all these menus are going to be the exact same on this panel. It just allows us to control split screens much easier. The next menu we have is traffic, so if we click on that, it'll bring up our traffic map on the MFD display. If we click that traffic setting one more time, we have several different options in here, and these are all pretty much the exact same options that we went over when we were looking at the PFD control panel. Next to that, we have weather, so if we tap on that, it'll bring up our weather map. And now if we tap on it one more time, it'll give us some more options that we can pick. Under the settings tab, we have a couple different options here. So we have radar, which is turned on, and it doesn't look like anything else there. We have orientation, so we can change that if we'd like. So I'll change that to north up. And the define coverage button does work, but it doesn't allow us to do anything as of yet. If we go back to the previous menu, we also have WX radar. If we click on that, it will bring up a radar screen on the MFD. We click it one more time, we can now see all the different options that we have here. We first need to start by turning the radar on. To the right hand side, we have display mode, so we can turn it in standby or weather. Below that, we have scan, so we can scan horizontally as what you see here, side to side, or we can scan vertically top to bottom. The other really neat thing is on the lower left-hand corner, we have a tilt line that we can select. So now that we're back on the main menu, in the second column, we have our Direct To button. If we click the Direct To, this will allow us to select a waypoint that we can just go direct to. So if we hit select waypoint, we're just going to put FD51, enter. And now it will tell us the course we need to go, and we can activate the Direct To. If we go down to the nearest tab, this will give us all the nearest airports that are around us. We can also click on this at the top and select VORs, NDBs, or all. Now this will make it really easy because if it's something near you, you can just scroll down, find the airport you need, click on it, and then click Activate as Direct To. And boom, you are on course to your next airport. It will even give you a bearing and a distance here at the top. Very handy. Next to Direct To, we have our flight plan. We'll get into that in episode number 2. To the right of that is our procedures, and again, we will go over that in episode number 2 as well. At the very bottom, we have aircraft systems,
utilities, performance, waypoint info, and nearest.
So let's start with the aircraft systems first. When you first get into the menu, we have 2 tabs over here on the left-hand side. We can adjust our control temperatures inside the aircraft. We can also select landing elevation altitude, or it can auto-select it for us. We have exterior lights, so we can turn on or off different lights. And we have the propulsion system. Below the controls tab, we have the synoptics tab. We click on that. We have several more pages that we can display aircraft information. Now, keep an eye on what's going to happen when I click one of these. You'll notice the screen automatically split. Now, I'll get into how to manipulate each of these panels here in just a second, and it's pretty easy once you know what to look for. But on the electrical panel, this is going to give us all the electrical information of the aircraft. We have the hydraulics panel, which will give us all of our hydraulics. Fuel will give us how much fuel and the fuel flow. Anti-ice will show us what surfaces have anti-ice turned on. The bleed air system, this is really helpful for when you're powering up the APU, so it'll let you know when you're able to start your engines. Flight control surfaces will give us all the flight control surfaces. Pre-flight will give us a simple pre-flight checklist, and we also have a summary page to kind of go over everything in one little page for us. To get back to our full screen, we can just hit the full screen button at the very bottom, and that will put us back in full screen mode. Under the Utilities tab, we have Weight and Fuel. So if we tap on this, this is where we're going to be able to set all of the weight, payload, takeoff, fuel, and landing information for the aircraft. We also have the ability to set up our minimums. We have timer, GPS status, which really doesn't do anything. And at the very bottom, we have setup. If you go into avionics setup, we can now go through and change a bunch of different things on our display. I don't really mess with much here, but if you want to change your time or units, here's where you would do that. So depending on what part of the world you're in, you may want to go through here and just set everything up to your preference. Under the alerts, we also have a callouts. So if you go into settings, we can change when we want to hear the various callouts. It's your personal preference. I think that is really a neat feature. Under MFD fields, again, we can go in and change all the different fields that are going to be displayed on our MFD. Under the audio tab, we can change our audio callout alert voice from either a female or a male. All right, so starting at the very bottom at the left, we have the performance button. This is where we can input some takeoff and landing data, as well as set our speed bugs. We can set flap speeds, and we can also adjust the weight and fuel here as well. So if we click on the takeoff, this will allow us to input all the different information for our takeoff airport or our departure airport. Same thing with landing. This we can input all the information for our arrival airport. Speed bugs are pretty self-explanatory, just like we went over on the PFD control. Weight and fuel, we just went over this in the other menu. It's the exact same menu. And our flap speeds, this will give us an awesome indicator as to when to use your flaps.
Halting way of speaking.
Next to performance, we have waypoint info, and here we can get all the information we need about pretty much any type of waypoint that we would like. So if we click on airports, we can have information as to the bearing, the distance, elevation. Under frequencies, we have all the different frequencies for that particular airport that we have at the top. Now, the other thing that I like to use this for is if you need to quick tune to either an ILS frequency or approach frequency, we can just select the approach, hit active, and it will automatically put it in our COM1 for us. If it's an ILS, it would automatically put that in our NAV1 frequency. So that is very helpful, so we don't have to go through all the different menus to get to our nav frequencies. Below the frequencies tab, we have weather, and this will give us all the current weather information about that particular waypoint, as well as the MEDAR information all the way at the very bottom. On the right-hand side, it will give us the different runways that are available, and below the runways, we have the procedure tab. This will give us all the different procedures that are available for this particular airport. If you tap on a procedure, you can actually load the procedure right from here, and you don't have to go into the flight planning menu. This is going to be very, very helpful if you need to make a quick change, and let's say there's an emergency up in the air. You want to go direct to a new airport. You can have that information in, select procedures, and then automatically load the approach for that airport. That is a very helpful feature in the G5000. We also have a waypoint options at the top to where we can show this on the map. Now, if you do tick on that, make sure that you untick that. The other option that we have is to go direct to that particular airport. So there's a couple different ways to do the direct to. Is you can either go to your waypoint info and select direct to, or you can go direct to here and select your waypoint. So there's many different ways to accomplish the same goal. To the right of waypoint, we have nearest, and this, of course, will give us all the nearest waypoints, airports that are closest to us. The other neat thing that I like about this particular menu is it also gives us a weather button. Remember, we were talking about earlier about splitting the monitor frequency between COM1 and COM2 so that we can listen to our ATIS information. If we click on the weather, this will give us the frequencies for our ATIS. So cool. If we tap on that frequency, we can now enter that into either a standby or an active. So here's where we can just enter that right in our COM2, switch our monitor to both, and now you can hear the ATIS in the background while we're also monitoring COM1. So that's going to take care of all the touch screen portion of the control panel. Now let's go ahead and look at the bottom. Now these knobs are going to be a little bit different from what we went over on the PFD control panel. Over here on the right hand side, this will still allow us to control our comms. In the center, this is going to control COM2 volume only, not COM1. Over on the left hand side, this is going to be our range button. Now we can also have the pan feature, so if we click in on this, you'll see the cursor populate up here, and we can use the touchpad to move that cursor around. The one feature that you do not see on the PFD control panel is this little box here that says pane. We go ahead and half the screen, and let's take a look at the top of the screen right now. Here's where you're going to know what controller is controlling what screen. At the very top of the screen, you will see this box is in like a teal or aqua color. We take a look over here on the PFD, you will see this screen is in a magenta color. Now remember what I told you earlier, you can use any of these range controls on the left hand side and it will only control this panel. If I come down to this side on the right, I can also control the range with the other MFD control panel. If you look on the actual control panel itself, you'll see this little teal box that is right above pane. If we look on the other control panel, you'll see the magenta box right above pane. That will tell us what screen is being controlled with this panel. So, because this is magenta, it's going to control the magenta screen. If I want to now control this side of the split screen, I can do it one of two ways. Here's where it can get really confusing. Because I can either use this side, and you'll see a little arrow here. If I click that, now that little blue box is highlighted on the right-hand side. And now I can use the controls here to control the range for this right-hand side. Same thing with the other side. I can go to the right side control, click over. Now I can use the right-hand control to control the left and the left-hand control to control the right. Now you'll say, okay, all right, so now how do I get control back over the left-hand side of the screen with our left-hand controller? Because if I were to go down here and switch which screen this is going to be pointing to, it now switches over to our PFD. So what you need to do is you can only highlight a screen if it is unhighlighted. So now what I have to do is to use the right-hand controller and move the highlighted portion to the right-hand page. And now I can go back to the PFD map that's highlighted in blue and switch that back to our left-hand MFD page. If I go full screen on this one, it's going to open up the full map. Now, when I did that, you will also notice when I went back in full mode, the right-hand controller automatically switches to our PFD screen.
What you've just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
The only way to get a split screen on your PFD is on the PFD control panel itself. Remember, this control panel will always... Alrighty folks, that's going to finish us up for today's video. If you guys have any comments or questions, post them down below in the comments section, and I'll get right back to you. If the video helped you out, be sure to hit that subscribe, tick on that little bell, and smash that thumbs up button. If you'd like to see part 2 of the video, click up here if it's available. And to all my flight simmer friends around the world, keep the blue side up. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.